evening and good to have you with us on this special edition of the Urban Debate. And what a day it's been. Extremely busy, hectic series of announcements. A budget like never before, like the Finance Minister promised. But of course, the opposition takes this phrase in entirely the opposite sense. We've spent the day analyzing the announcements, digging into the budget documents. A lot more has to be done. We still have a lot more of questions, a lot more of papers that we must scrutinize for the fine print. But of the big headlines the government brought to us with the budget announcement, we have some very basic pertinent questions to ask. So over the next 1 hour, we'll have a panel of experts, senior journalists, economists joining us right now, representatives from various sectors to tell us how they see these budget announcements and if it will actually help usher in a new India. I have 5 very basic questions that I'm going to ask over the next 1 hour. First one, the question that was on the minds of everybody, we repeatedly kept talking about it: will this budget give more money in the hands of people? Even if it's not directly, indirectly, does it meet that target of putting more money in the hands of people so that the spending can go up and so that the economy can be revived? Next, I will be asking, does this budget address the unemployment challenge, a challenge that had already peaked before the pandemic hit us? We had the worst kind of unemployment numbers in a 4-decade-long history. And add to that the lockdown and what's happened since then. How much of that unemployment challenge does this budget address? Then, does the budget address concerns of the badly hit sectors, real estate, retail, aviation, tourism, MSMEs, SMEs? What about these sectors, including the other ones we constantly talk about, such as the farm sector? Next up, does the budget address the long-standing agri issues, especially in the middle of the farmers' protests that we are looking at and the block that the farm laws have run into? And of course, the final one, what this record-breaking allocation really means for healthcare. It sounds really good as a headline, but we will be breaking it down to see what it really means for the healthcare sector. So let's say good evening to the panelists who are joining us right now with me in the studios through the day. And now again, our managing editor, Mr. Vinay Tiwari. Good evening to Vinay. Let's also say good evening to Surjit Mazumdar, Professor for the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, Madan Sabnavis, Chief Economist at Care Ratings, Mr. P. Balaji, Chief Regulatory and Corporate Affairs Officer at Vodafone Idea, Siddhartha Sanal, Chief Economist and Head of Research at Bandhan Bank, Saugata Bhattacharya, Executive VP for Business and Economic Research at Axis Bank. Yamini Iyer was with us in the morning as well, is back with us, President and Chief Executive for the Center for Policy Research. And Anil Padmanabhan, so good to have him here, senior journalist, joins us this evening. So we've got a power-packed panel and voices from all segments. First up, a quick question to Vinay. Since we've had so many conversations of what has to be expected and what government should be doing, Vinay, one of the key areas was healthcare. And from the face of it, it does look like that has been addressed. But if we go step by step and if we go topic by topic, the first one was to say, has it addressed the concerns that were raised so far? What is your sense?
Well, I mean, on healthcare specifically, the drought is so huge that possibly even double of that amount would not be fully adequate. But I guess it's for the first time that a budget has recognized the importance of healthcare. And I guess the pandemic in some ways left a positive imprint on that we've at least recognized it's an important area. I know there has been some criticism about this allocation looking a little more ballooned than possibly what it is, because it includes the Jal Mantralaya as well as the Sanitation Mantralaya and all of those schemes.
Yes.
But I have personally been a very big believer of that, because I believe that the healthcare burden on India has a lot to do with, especially the non-communicable diseases burden, comes a lot from the poor, very poor quality of sanitation and water that exists. And it is good that that allocation is being seen also as a health allocation, because in some ways it's a contributing factor. Of course, there are other, issues that will come up as we move along.
Yes.
There is a 32,000 crore purely for vaccination. That's not an infra investment. That's a one-time investment that you'll need to undergo for
But
this year
that's
at least.
also an investment
But that's
that
an
you
investment.
couldn't have
That's an
avoided right
investment.
now. That's an allocation you had to do in this year.
But
So-
I also believe that while the central government has possibly done its part to the extent that it could by giving us the biggest spend on health infra, I just do hope that in the next month or a half or so, when other states start presenting their budgets, they follow suit and increase their state budget health allocation as well, because that's critical to improving our health infrastructure.
Okay, and as far as putting money in the hands of people is concerned, well, there are no on-the-face tax cuts, but there are some small little things being tweaked here and there. With that,
yeah, I'm happy the tax slabs have not been touched, because that shows continuation of policy, so that's good.
Yeah.
Some part of good news also comes from some amount of technical relief to the elderly when they don't have to file taxes. Also, I think the clarification on the dividend tax, the advanced dividend tax, is also welcome, because the earlier policy was frankly a little odd.
Yes.
There was no logic to that, and it's good that they've corrected that. But how much of these infra push issues, or the investment that government is planning to do through capital expenses will give a fillip to the money in people's hand by generating employment is an execution issue, and I think that's something we can discuss as we go along.
Okay, so let me go across to Mr. Madan Sabnavis. Mr. Sabnavis, for many experts say that the government needs to approach it in a way where you put more money in the hands of people. That's the only way to boost spending. There is no point in fixing the supply side if there is no demand. Does this budget address that problem?
No, actually, it does not. In fact, I think it's quite a satisfactory budget. There were three things we were looking out for. One was fiscal consolidation. And I think they've shown that they're not in a hurry to go in for fiscal consolidation, which is a good idea. Second was in terms of spending more. I think they're spending in the right places. So I think that's also positive. And what Vinay was saying is also true, that this health expenditure has been probably overstated because a lot of numbers coming from other ministries have been combined.
Yes.
Because if you just look at the allocation for the health ministry, it's the same as around 70,000 crores. But I think what they've missed out is in terms of giving any kind of incentives to households, either for consumption or for savings. And I think that's what's missing in the budget. But of course, we can't expect a budget to be a panacea for all our problems. They had to do most of it. And I think 2 out of 3 is not a bad strike rate.
And what about, the plan for infrastructure spending, which is expected to bring in a lot more of jobs? Yamini Iyer, will that effectively at least bring in some more revival in demand?
I think 2 things were expected of this budget in terms of addressing the jobs issue. One was, of course, increase in capital expenditure, the big infrastructure push. But we know that the big infrastructure push needs a lot of what Arvind Subramaniam has called the software of the Indian economy. And there certainly seem to be quite a few important reforms in that direction: the bad banks, the DFI, some amount of recapitalization of PSBs. But the challenge is that many of these are not going to yield results in the near term. These are big governance issues that need to be resolved. And the government of India is notorious for delayed project starts, delayed payments, etc., etc., etc. So even as CapEx was increased, which is a step in the right direction, there was certainly an expectation that elevated welfare expenditure ought to remain at current levels, ideally a lot more, given that Narega demand still outstrips supply at current elevated allocations. And I see that at least for FY22, has not increased for the moment. There seems to be overall, actually, expenditure has not increased significantly for FY22, and the assumption seems to be that elevated expenditures of FY21 will be enough for us to tide us through. I think that expectation is probably a little too optimistic, given the nature of the recovery of the Indian economy, which in my view is very much K-shaped, not V-shaped.
K-shaped and not V-shaped. All right, let's get in some more views. P. Balaji, Chief Regulatory and Corporate Affairs Officer of Vodafone Idea here. Mr. Balaji, increasing spending or putting more money in the hands of people can be done in various ways. You could either give them direct tax, income tax relief, which hasn't been done here, or you could look at helping some of these sectors which are down and out, so helping those small businesses, MSMEs or SMEs, and thereby ensuring that people get back to better salary levels, people get back to the jobs they had, and businesses start flourishing. In all of this, what is your own sense? Has enough been done to boost consumer sentiment and spending?
Thank you so much, Tanvi. Let me speak to you today as the chairman of the National Digital Council of ASSOCHAM. I think there are two or three things which are important to highlight. One is that the budget is very positive in terms of making sure that it's focused on the 6 pillars that the finance minister talked about, putting more focus on infrastructure, on wellness and health and so on. These are important initiatives, number one. Number two, if I look at it, even during the course of the pandemic itself, certain priorities were identified by the government. I think if I look at digital as a sector, the focus on Digital India over the years, as well as on PLI schemes to make sure that you can actually kickstart manufacturing of electronics and mobile phones in the country, has been a strong focus. So a lot of initiatives have been done during the pandemic. Some of it is now in operation. Of course, the budget directionally gives the right messages. There is reforms talked about. There is disinvestment focus. Instead of kind of using taxes as a means to kind of drive revenues, they're basically looking at disinvestment and monetizing assets. Those are very positive statements. FDI going up in certain sectors from 49 to 74 in insurance is again a positive step. So in a way, these are very strong statements being made for the government to say that, look, there are going to be sectors where private sector's participation will be even more than before. And I think that sends an overall positive signal, so to say. And as the execution starts to improve of these programs, I'm quite certain that we'll see the multiplier effect for the economy as a whole. And so when you have growth, then you're in a position to also make sure that a lot of these the things that you mentioned are sorted out in the course of growth, which is obviously focused on inclusive growth.
Vinay, let's move on to the second part, which is, of course, the question that we are asking: does this address the challenge of unemployment? Now, this government, Vinay, has always been a believer that it's not about directly creating jobs, but creating environments where job creation automatically takes place, businesses happen, entrepreneurship gets boosted. So that effectively will be the way we'll have to look at this challenge.
Yes, and that's the one thing I'm very curious to hear our experts speak about, because look, there has been one argument, and a lot of economists have made the argument that it would have served the purpose of employment a little better if the government had boosted spend on existing projects rather than try and create new projects. Simply because experience shows that Indian project taking off periods are so high, they get bogged down in litigation, there is politics, there is environmental hurdles, and there are all kinds of issues. Something as simple as land acquisition can take years, if not longer. And then the whole idea, if the intent is for this fiscal, the benefit of it will come probably much later. So does this address the immediate problem of providing jobs employment is a question mark, because obviously these are not things that will get revitalized right away. There are real estate sector, for instance, is under huge stress currently, and a lot of unfinished projects, lack of demand, all of those issues remain. And that's, as we all know, a big employer in any case. MSMEs as well. There is a huge employment gap there currently. There is a skill deficiency issue, there is a supply issue, and there is, of course, a demand issue. So whether that has been addressed or not is again a question mark. But which really brings down to this question, that if this is a statement of intent, if budgets are a statement of intent, the real challenge for me is the execution of it, because we are great in intent, but sometimes not the best in execution. And unfortunately, we also in the media are guilty of that, because ideally the assessment of a government's performance should be on the basis of revised estimates and not the budgetary estimates, where we see how much was actually spent and in which direction, which rarely happens.
Yeah, often for sure, broadcast journalists forget to go back to look into those documents and do the comparison, and then we of course depends on the experts and the economists who join us. So let me ask this question to Siddharth Sanyal. Mr. Sanyal, if we don't as is being said, if we don't come out with special packages for MSMEs, SMEs, various sectors which seem to be in pain today, and simply focus on infrastructure spending, will that help fix the unemployment problem?
That's a very pertinent point. The way I see it, I'll possibly take a step back first. Till about 12 hours back, the big debate was whether the government is going to spend enough, whether the government is going to bite the bullet to allow the fiscal deficit to expand, take that particular risk, and actually come out decisively with a revised FRBM target as well as a near-term deficit target to support growth. I think on that particular count, this time, while there had been certain elements of disappointment in earlier in the summer, this time you have to give the government very high marks on that. That they have taken a very decisive stance that at this juncture we are going to support growth, and we'll deal the problem of fiscal deficit and financing of that at a subsequent stage. So I think they have made their mind very clear. The message is very clear. The policy resolve is very strong. So first point is big fiscal spending. Then comes the question of the classical debate of today versus tomorrow. I think at this juncture, they have surprised us with the element of tomorrow. The element of today is not that pronounced. But having said that, I think what the government might be trying to do at this juncture is to align our spending in better with our long-term priorities. But 6 months down the line, 2-3 quarters down the line, if there is a feeling that the near term needs to be supported more, not that that cannot be done even at that point of time.
Actually, that's a fair point. And Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya, would you agree that this is just a part of it? But of late, we've seen in the last few years, nothing stops the government from coming out with announcements or more schemes in the middle of it. Madan, I see your hand, but let me just get Saugata in and then I'll come to you. Mr. Bhattacharya, can you hear me? Okay, I'm not too sure if he's able to hear us. We're going to fix that line. Go ahead, Madan Sablavis.
Yeah, actually, we should remember one thing, that the budget is an income and expenditure statement of the government. To expect something for every sector in the budget, to my mind, is not really a fair thing. Because we've had policies announced during the Atmanirbhar time. So I think lots of things have been affected. And the reason why we look at capital expenditure is because it's directly a part of your budget. It comes under your capital expenditure. There are certain allocations. So I think that's why we have been focusing on capex and infrastructure. So I don't think we should mix up things by saying that real estate should get something, SME should be getting something, FMCG should be getting something. I think we'll miss the point otherwise. That's just a point.
Okay, fair point. Mr. Anil Padmanabhan, good evening to you. Your view on if we are at least acknowledging and managing to address some part of the unemployment issue.
See, Tanvi, I think I like to be a contrarian here. We are approaching this debate the wrong way. You're all assuming that this was a perfectly normal circumstance and you were assessing this government in this budget in that backdrop. But it's not so. You have had a devastating pandemic, which has knocked the bottom out of the world economy, the Indian economy in particular. So the kind of metrics you have to use here is what is it that you're doing to stabilize and what is it that you're going to do going forward. In terms of stabilization, they have done a decent job, which I think all the other analysts will also agree in terms of the economic survey data. We're going by that. Is the only information we have. And the launch of the vaccine. So this contact economy, which is primarily one of the biggest segments of the service economy, aviation and hospitality, will probably start coming back into its own. So here you have a running economy, which is about 2.7 trillion prior to the pandemic, which has taken a knock. You're restoring that. And now going forward, what you're doing, this government, to this credit to what we see in the budget, is that they have announced several rounds of structural reforms, which are extremely fundamental in nature. I'll just cite one to make my point. It is on disinvestment. They should actually have called it the policy of privatization. They have said, but for a clutch of central PSUs, everything else will either be privatized or closed. So in that sense, they're sending out a big signal in terms of where they want to take the economy. Now, like somebody said, the issue is in the execution. That's a different game. But I'm just looking at what they put before us. I don't have a crystal ball to tell you how it will pan out or it won't. That we have to wait and see. But as of now, they have done a decent job in shoring up the economy and given you markers on the direction of change.
So let me ask you a counter to that then, Mr. Padmanabhan. Using the same benchmark that we've gone through an unprecedented time, it's been a pandemic and a recession. The government's entire plan that they have announced is basis two things: an increase of 15% in tax collections and a very, very high disinvestment target that includes land monetization and some amount of stake sale in government-owned companies. Now, on that front also, are we being realistic? Only if the money comes in can we be spending it?
No, I don't think they have linked it to the money coming in. They are willing to spend that money. And it's a question of them able to match this estimate next Feb 1st, right?
Yeah.
So you are assuming that the economy will not pick up. Obviously, the finance minister assumes otherwise. And that's how she's made her projections. I'm saying we only have the information that she has served us. None of us have information where we can second guess her. So I'm saying you examine her claims against what she has served us. Don't examine her claims A against a normal economy and B against what will happen on Feb 1st next year. I don't know, you don't know. Only she knows to a degree. Even she doesn't know.
Yeah, I don't think that she would also know. I mean, if we had to ask her the same question last year this time, she wouldn't have known what we went through or we would have gone through, where she would have had to junk the entire budget statement she made in February and start from scratch again and come out with a series of mini budgets. Surajit Majumdar, what is your view?
Well, let me be even more contrarian than Mr. Padmanabhan, which is this, that the budget seems to be a retreat from a fiscal stimulus that was never there in the first place. You were talking about unemployment in this country. Large-scale unemployment and its implications for the earnings from employment, low wages, was the source of a demand problem in the economy even before COVID. COVID has aggravated that problem. The evidence of this constraint is the fact that for 10 years, you have been trying to promote private investment, but investment has been stagnating. It's a decade-long period of evidence that you have to substantiate that proposition. Now, what you do in this budget is that you plan to spend in the coming year an amount which is in nominal terms identical to the amount that your accounts show you are going to spend by the end of 2021, which means in real terms you are reducing the level of the expenditure. How that can possibly be a way of inducing demand, I don't understand. Even the elevated expenditure of 2020-21 is partly artificial because of a changed system where instead of making the FCI borrow from the National Small Savings Funds, you have transferred that amount onto the budget. So it is not, and that's, if you look at the food subsidy bill, that's really the source of the increase of 4 lakh crores between RE 2020-21 and BE 2020-21. So there has not been actually any significant increase in expenditure in the year that is ending, and the real expenditure of the next year, as per the budget's projections, are going to be even less. Now, this is therefore can only be described as trying to retreat from a stimulus that was never there in the first place. And if the only reason you have a high fiscal deficit is because of the fact that your revenues are collapsed, and the revenue position is going to, as per the budget projections, remain poor in the coming year, and no effort has been made to try and improve the realization of revenues to increase the revenues. So you're not either increasing revenues, nor are you stepping up expenditures, nor are you actually even giving any kind of supposedly major tax benefits which can induce increased expenditure. So there's no stimulus element at all in this particular budget as far as I can see. And given the fact that an illusion has been sort of created that a significant stimulus was actually given in the last 1 year, the fine print that one has to look for is a little different from the ones that were being discussed. So if you don't have any increase in expenditure, how do you have a substantial increase in expenditure? If the total expenditure doesn't increase. It is this juggling and playing around, cut somewhere here, increase somewhere there, and then project the increase as the real increase. That's the exercise that has been done, which is why the fine print needs to be looked at even more.
I have a just quick follow-up for Surajit before you go to the other experts, which is this, that Surajit, are you at least willing to give one positive mark to the government for at least acknowledging the FCI borrowing to the SSA, because so far this was hidden as in terms of understanding our fiscal deficit. At least now it's become transparent. They've added that at least, and so far they were not even acknowledging it as a measure of showing that the fiscal thing is under control.
Yes, it's true that they didn't acknowledge it earlier. Now they're acknowledging it. But when you didn't acknowledge it, what were you doing? You were window dressing accounts. When you are acknowledging it, firstly, what you're doing is you're trying to show that in a context of a pandemic, you are not behind many of the other economies in the world in the size of the stimulus that you've given. So that's also window dressing. And more importantly, if this is now brought into the budget and you set the fiscal deficit target that you ultimately want to reduce it to, after having brought that in, then the expenditure compression element in the years going forward is going to be even.
Okay, very interesting point. And this one is open for a challenge. If anybody disagrees, Yamini did raise a hand in between. Go ahead, please. Meanwhile, make your point.
No, I don't disagree. In fact, I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah.
And I think two things I wanted to say. I think one, it's very important to recognize, especially in times of crisis. And as Anil said, this is a budget that was being presented in unprecedented times and should be judged on that metric. For the break in tradition in terms of the fiscal deficit numbers and complete transparency on the part of the finance minister. This is an important step. One of the many reasons offered for a fairly conservative so-called fiscal stimulus in the early days of the pandemic was a sense that this would hit market sentiments. I think credibility of our fiscal numbers, which have been in question for many years, is more important than credit ratings for how market sentiment will play out. So in that sense, it's a very important step forward. But it is important to recognize, as the previous speaker said, that overall for FY22, expenditures are not increasing. In fact, in real terms, they are static or marginally contracting. We'll see how GDP numbers play out by the end of the FY to be able to be more certain about this. Also, very importantly, you're seeing cuts in two of the most important pillars of spending that particularly for rural were important, Narega and the public distribution system. And I think that these cuts going forward are, the assumption seems to be that the economy will, sequential recovery will ensure that spending for vulnerable communities will not be necessary. I think that that's a little bit of flawed judgment there. I also think that against the backdrop of the migrant crisis, the fact that except for one nation, one ration card, which is to be completed, we didn't see an articulation of a possible expansion of our social protection network, social safety net, and particularly for urban vulnerable communities. As the economy recovers, more rural workers will start heading back to urban India. Current profit-led recovery doesn't seem to show that jobs will come immediately. So a need for a safety net was necessary, and the absence of that, I think, is serious.
Madan?
Yeah, in fact, I have a slightly different view from Surajit. So I think this is a stimulus because the way you define the stimulus is important. Okay, because I think, sorry. Phone ringing. Yeah, because the way you look at the fiscal deficit, the amount of borrowing which you're doing in the market. So if you go into the theoretical sense, what is the deficit? A fiscal deficit is something where we're saying that you're spending because you're borrowing money, you're creating money, you're printing money. Here we are, of course, borrowing when we're making sure that the fiscal deficit target is met. So I think we are spending more, and there's been a good reallocation of expenditures to what is we could consider to be more productive in terms of capex. So and if you're going to, of course, compare with the revised numbers, it looks as if it's the same number, but we need to actually compare with the budget numbers because the expenditures which were incurred in the revised numbers which we are seeing is because of the pandemic. The government could have rolled back saying, look, I'm going to be happy with a fiscal deficit ratio of say 5% or 4%, but I think they are persevering with a higher number. So I would still think that it is a stimulus which is being provided, but though not probably in the true orthodox sense in which.
No, so I'm just trying to break it down and make it simpler for our viewers to understand because I've seen the math that has been presented, for example, the agriculture sector, and it doesn't look like there is much increase in the allocation there than what was. The Manrega allocation largely stays the same as it did last year in February. Of course, because it was an unprecedented time, the government later on went ahead and increased that. And so now we've come down to the levels of 70,000 odd crore rupees. The defense budget allocation has just about gone up by 4,000 crore rupees. So if we, break it down in terms of the larger segments, where is this big boost? Is it largely in the infrastructure segment? Mr. Anil Padmanabhan.
No, Tanvi, I just wanted to make a small intervention that just to clarify, the Manrega is a demand-based program.
Yes.
So don't worry about what the budgeted amount is. Last year, they paid out over 1 trillion, while the budgeted amount was substantially lower. So it's a demand-based program. The government of India has no option, but they have to furnish the amount as and when they get it. They can delay it, but they can't deny it. So just that.
No, actually, I had a follow-up question to Madan. Is it right? I mean, my personal back of the envelope calculation tells me that the government will end up spending about nearly 8 lakh crores on simply, repaying the interest on the debt. And if you calculate that amount, effective spending actually is either at par or probably lower than what you had this year. Because I think this current year was about 6.8 lakh or 6.9 lakh crores in terms of, repaying the debt. So by that logic, it is not exactly a boost. Would that not be a fair assumption?
You see, it's the way you look at it. If I want to compare it with the revised numbers, as I had mentioned, the revised numbers came higher because of certain reasons, which are not normal reasons. And as what Anil was saying is that, okay, we had a higher NREGA program because it's a demand-based program. It's not to say that we have to spend 1 lakh crores every year to prove that we are doing something for the rural poor. Okay, because normally, historically, we have had numbers like 55, 60,000 crores. Now, we had an increase because there was a pandemic. So I think moving from 1 lakh crores to say 70,000 crores, which you're talking of now, does not really mean that we are sidestepping this particular sector. There's a certain reason why we had it, and therefore we spend the money.
Okay, let's also say good evening to Mr. Saugata Bhattacharya, Executive VP for Business and Economic Research for Axis Bank. Good evening to you, and I'm speaking to you after so long. Good to have you on this panel, Mr. Bhattacharya. The debate right now is about the allocations that the government has made for the biggest of the sectors and whether it is actually an increase in spending or some financial jugglery that we're looking at that just gives us a lot of hope.
No, it's not financial jugglery. I think I heard the last speaker say that they have to be commended.
Yes.
It's not as if the numbers were hidden from analysts. I mean, we knew to the last detail what allocations were going through. The common man probably did not. So we knew how much was the off-balance sheet spending. All credit analysts know what they know where in the budget to look for. So it's not as if it was hidden, but it was hidden largely from the common public. Now, let me just tell you in terms of, I'm not talking of the exact specific spends, of the difference of about 4.4 lakh crores in expenditure from the FY21 this year's budget estimate, the one that was presented in July, to this year, about 4.4 lakh crores, of which will be a subsidy.
Mr. Bhattacharya, I'm sorry, I will have to ask you to repeat a bit of it because your feed froze, so we missed a part of what you just said.
Sorry. Of the 4.4 lakh crores additional expenditure. Am I audible?
Yes. Go ahead, please.
So of the 4.4 lakh additional expenditure, about interest is about 1 lakh crores. Payments to FCI is about 1.25 lakh crores. Transfers to states is about 0.9 lakh crores, 90,000 crores. Rural spending is about 50,000 crores. Roads is about 63,000 crores. And the allocation to the DEA, you remember that allocation to finance for spending to states, that's about 53,000 crores. That's the broad spend that we had. I know, this is an attempt to get a lot of the off-balance sheet items back into the budget, which itself is a very commendable exercise. Trying to get everything below the line, all the items that were off-balance sheet come back into line. So all of that is good. It's not as if spending has increased massively. Spending cannot increase massively.
Yes.
Because till revenue stabilize, I really hope that they really go in for the asset monetization and disinvestment program, because that will open up space for spending. Opinions for 5 economists. Whether to spend it on capex, whether to spend it on paying all the dues that are owed to MSMEs, other programs, etc. Whether to spend it on infrastructure finance, all of that will come in. But the essential point is that first you need to get the revenues out from this year onto the less than 4.5 FRBM target that they were talking about in FY26. How best to use the existing resources, and this is a great time. For whatever reason, asset prices are high. So, this is the time to monetize asset prices, all the existing assets in the system. Get the divestment program, disinvestment program going up and running. Get as much as you can out of tax analytics, etc., to increase compliance for taxes, and that will open up space for spending. The next question is how best to spend. That is an open question that I'll leave to you guys.
A very interesting, perspective that you've added to this, and let me see if Siddhartha Sanyal has a view to this.
Yes, absolutely. Just to add to what Saugata just mentioned, I think without getting into too much of details of some of the earlier points that were raised, I think the big point here is 2 points. One is at this juncture, the government was really stuck between a rock and a hard place. There were no easy options. And in this particular situation also, they seem to be trying to first bite the bullet, going for taking a big, clear call that at this juncture will not be bogged down, will be going for spending and try to stimulate the economy to some extent. Bringing back some bit of transparency, which is really a positive thing. Whether there is an ulterior motive or not, I'll look at the end result. That more transparency is better. And the third thing is that it looks like at this moment that while we were faced by many challenges, the end result is actually the government is trying to create some opportunity out of the of these challenges, because otherwise in normal times, monetizing some of the assets, etc., the debate had been on for a very, very long period of time without much progress. Now in this process, if they make some good progress on that, I think there is something very interesting and encouraging out of the overall, despite the very difficult times on many counts.
Okay, very quickly, one of the questions that I did want to ask again is, what does this record-breaking allocation really mean for the healthcare segment? So let me just put that question across to Yamini Iyer. Yamini Iyer, the Congress party says, and I think they've rightfully pulled out some of the breakup that later on we also looked at, is this includes the vaccine allocation. This also includes your water and sanitation allocation, your finance grants, and some of the other categories, including Swachh Bharat. So effectively, it's not an increase of 130%, but much, much lower. That being said, it's still much higher than what any of the previous governments have actually done. Would that be correct?
We've consistently spent far too little on what is far too important. And even from pure economic terms, once you reduce out-of-pocket expenditure on healthcare, immediately it frees up monies amongst even the most vulnerable for consumption. So increases in health of any amount are welcome. Against the backdrop of the pandemic, there most certainly was an expectation of a significant increase. There was a very interesting announcement that was made at the start of the budget speech about a new scheme, PMSASBY, if I remember it right. I haven't been able to see any specific allocations on that for this year, but there is a commitment to about 60,000 crores over a 6-year period. And some of the details that were articulated about that I found quite compelling, including a block level public health management system, focus on disease surveillance, etc. So clearly, and labs at the district level. So clearly, some of the lessons of where the weaknesses in our public health infrastructure rest have been heard by the government. And there also seems to be at least the beginnings of some medium-term plan of expenditure on these core elements of public health, which is welcome. Certainly, I would have certainly liked to see a far more generous allocation into public health. And I guess we have to wait to look more closely at what this new Pradhan Mantri Swasthya Yojana delivers in terms both of its design and allocation, to be able to say anything more than that.
Oh, yes, absolutely. But, this is the conversation we also had in the run-up to the budget, to say there is so much that has to be done in healthcare. For year after year, we've not even given 2% of our GDP to this sector, and it's been crying out for attention. If anything, from the pandemic, we've learned that. But in order to even begin to do that, we first have to deal with the pandemic itself. We first have to get people vaccinated. And so, obviously, that amount of attention and focus first has to go on the COVID vaccination front. But the government has recognized the need for bigger schemes and better allocation for nutrition as well, and other vaccination programs. So again, like Mr. Anil Padmanabhan said, this is an announcement, and we must appreciate that the government has done that part. What is the implementation of the statement of intent? We will have to wait and watch. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for joining us. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate each one of you taking your time out, and really to hear all kinds of views about how they're reading this budget document is what is interesting about this. At the end of the day, the government's presented one side, but it's these experts who actually go through page after page, not just of this document and announcements today, but compare it to earlier times and where the money is going to come from, where the money is going to go, and then put it all together to make some sense out of it. I hope it was helpful for you. We've got some exclusive conversations lined up on the other side. India's Chief Economic Advisor will be joining us in just a bit. Stay with me.